You may be familiar with this icon. It's sometimes called the Rubia icon based on the artist who made it. And if you know anything about it, you might have a hint as to the virtue that we're talking about today. And by the way, if you want to mute, you can. That way we won't get as much background noise. It's on the bottom corner. Hit the mute button there. So what is a virtue? It's how do we practice hospitality amidst the lockdown, and does it matter? There's a couple reasons why I chose this. The first is that, so Chad and I talked last week, and we had done we were going to do like just a video one to put online, but the video quality ended up being kind of choppy and we didn't want to give you subpar content. I blatantly stole a lot of Chad's ideas and used them in an episode of the Catholic Podcast yesterday. So that'll be going live today as well. So I didn't want this to be repetitive of that. So I would encourage you, and we can give a link in the, when we put this on YouTube, we can put a link to that as well. I'd encourage you, if you want to get more stuff on what does it look like to live out Easter amidst a quarantine, that was kind of the theme of that conversation. But like I said, I didn't want to do the same thing twice. And so as we were praying the rosary, we were doing the School of Faith Daily Rosary yesterday. Mike mentioned something about hospitality in the context of St. Faustina. And I thought, wow, that is a virtue that just has dropped off the radar for me. You know, like the idea of hospitality right now seems so absurd. Like, you're at home, you're not allowed to have anyone over. Why are we even talking about hospitality, and what does hospitality look like? So that was kind of the idea. So I want to look at 5 aspects. We did a little bit of housekeeping at the top. So I want to look at 5 things. We can call it the salvific necessity of hospitality. Then what does hospitality look like? And then we'll also look there at what doesn't hospitality look like. The third is very briefly on the decline of hospitality. And then to kind of put it in a little more practical way, we'll look at the logic of hospitality. Why is it so important? Why is it salvifically necessary? And then how can we practice it today? So with that in mind, 2 of these 5 parts are going to be very short. You might be thinking, that's a lot of material. And it might be, but I think it'll go a little quicker than it sounds like. The first is on the salvific necessity of hospitality. So we get this in the Last Judgment, which, you know, you just saw. This is that famous Michelangelo painting of the Last Judgment, or fresco of the Last Judgment. And he says to the saved, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And he says to the damned, I was a stranger and you did not welcome me. Like, this is a pivot point. Like, this is one of the areas that really makes a difference. And so we can speak here without exaggeration of hospitality being salvifically necessary. And, you know, of course, the saved say, well, when did we welcome you? And the unsaved say, well, when didn't we welcome you? And what does Christ say? Well, whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. So if we refuse to welcome Christ, we cannot be saved. If we refuse to welcome the least of these, we're not welcoming Christ. So it's a big deal, this idea of hospitality. And so I want to tee that up. We're not just talking about social etiquette. We're not just talking about how to be polite so people invite you to dinner parties. This is about how do I welcome Christ in others? And how do I acknowledge Christ in others? What does that look like? Well, we're back to this Rubiev icon, because this icon is really rich. These are the 3 angels, and we'll get into a little bit of their identity in a bit, who appear to Abraham and then to Lot. And this is them being dined by Abraham. So this is a scene from Genesis 18. It says that the Lord appeared to Abraham, and sometimes by the terebinth, but it means the oaks of Mamre, while Abraham is sitting at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. So it's the middle of the day, he is in the shade, and he sees the Lord appear to him, and the Lord appears to him in the form of 3 men, which is a little hint at the Trinity, right? So when he saw them, he runs forth from the tent door to meet them. He bows himself. He goes prostrate to the earth. And he says, my Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree, while I fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that, you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. Oh, Chad's saying he can't see the image. Can everybody else see the screen here? Somebody say yes or no.
You have it blocked right now. You can't see it, just the words. It was showing before.
Yeah. Okay, so the image here.
Yeah,
now
you
it's
can
good.
see part of it.
Now I can see it.
Yeah, okay. That's just the way I had it. I didn't want to make the font too small. But anyway, so this is what's being described. That the angels have appeared and Abraham is entertaining them. And he rushes out. He goes prostrate before and he serves them because he recognizes that it's not really just angels, it's the Lord. So the angels say, okay, we'll do this. So he goes into the tent, says to Sarah, make quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes. So he then goes to the herd. He takes a tender and good calf. He has it slaughtered. He takes curds and milk and the calf, and he sets all this feast before them. And then, rather than just sitting down with them, he actually stands by them under the tree while they ate. So he serves them. He waits on them. He attends to any need they might have, just as visitors who have come before him in the heat of the day. It's an incredible image of hospitality. And I think we might be tempted to say Abraham goes too far. So I want to contrast him with his nephew, Lot, because the angels continue on their journey. And it says, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, bowed himself with his face to the ground, and said, my lords, turn aside, I pray you, to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can get up early, go on your way. And they say, no, we'll spend the night in the street. So quick point here. Abraham's offer, they said yes to. Lot's they say no to. We aren't attuned to the etiquette or what it would look like to be truly hospitable. We should get something in this response that there's some reason they're rejecting what Lot says rather than what Abraham says. But Lot goes ahead and he nags him basically. He says he urged them strongly. So they turn aside and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now there's a Jewish commentator who I really like, Leon Cass. He's a philosopher. And he explains this context that we're probably missing. That Abraham's conduct, the excellence of it is made clear by comparing it to Lot's. When they come to see Lot, the men are called angels and appear to him directly as such. And he says Lot apparently wouldn't have been able to penetrate the disguise. Unlike Abraham, he would not be able to see the divine within the human. And as Christians, we want to say yes, especially if this is literally some sort of prefigurement of the Holy Trinity. The 2 possibilities are these are the 3 persons of the Trinity, or this is God appearing in some form with 2 angels. Either way, they are like Lot isn't going to get it without making it pretty clear. And so Lot, we find him hanging around the gate of the city, but unlike Abraham, he's not rushing out. Like Abraham leaves his tent, he rushes out as soon as he sees the guy, where Lot basically greets him at the gate. And then he kind of nags him, and his offer is less gracious, less generous, and so it's initially rejected. His meal is less adequate, and he's making it by himself. So, as Leon Cass puts it, Mrs. Lot is not in evidence. The entire house is poorly organized to receive strangers. So, he has, if Abraham is like great, Lot's is okay. And then, of course, anyone familiar with the history of Sodom, and yeah, Scott pointed out, it's striking that there's unleavened bread here. Yeah, so unleavened bread, the significance is it's really quick, it's easy to make. So this would be, in modern times, a little bit like microwaving something for someone who's dropped by. Like Lot is unprepared to receive strangers. And that's the thing that's so incredible is Abraham isn't unprepared. Abraham is ready with extra food in case an unexpected guest stops by. That's the kind of hospitality that he's living out. And we are at our best, I think, like Lot. And Genesis is viewing Lot as like not doing a very good job of living this virtue. And of course, the terrible example of hospitality, inhospitality, radical inhospitality, are the men of Sodom, who they gather around the house and they want to sexually assault the angels. They want to assault these men because they say, hey, these are strangers, these are travelers on their way, they're really vulnerable, we can take advantage of them. And in Ezekiel, we hear about this as a sort of radical inhospitality. So it says, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, an excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. In other words, all of these things were available, but instead of doing that, they took advantage of these travelers to try to sexually assault them. And so it's a pretty radical, like a pretty radical difference from Abraham. Okay, so of course, Sodom is destroyed. The angels destroy the city of Sodom. Lot is saved. You see him there leaving the city, kind of grumpy looking, with his daughters and his wife turning into a pillar of salt behind him. And it's striking that Genesis 19 says that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, he remembered not Lot, he remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. So in other words, I think there's something to this idea that Lot is really being viewed as like an okay but not great guy, because he's doing kind of the mediocre, if that makes sense. By the way, if you're not muted, you might want to push mute just for now because we're getting a fair amount of background noise. Okay. I think it's better now. So there's something to Leon Cass's description. There's something to this idea that Lot is kind of saved almost in spite of himself. Like he's obviously better than the men of Sodom, but he's not living up to what Abraham is offering. And then just as kind of a theological aside, Hebrews 13 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. And so there's that which would suggest that they're probably angels, but then in Genesis 18, we hear it described as the Lord appearing to Abraham. So we can say, is it the Lord? Is it angels? Is it both? Angel means messenger, so I think we can say yes to both. Okay. So that's an Old Testament example. It may not be that relevant to us. What does it look like in the New Testament? What does it look like in the New Covenant? If you go to a Benedictine monastery even today, you'll find monks who are living in 2020 by the rule of St. Benedict. And the rule of St. Benedict has an entire chapter on hospitality and on how we treat guests. And it says that all guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. For Christ says, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Proper honor must be shown to all, especially to those who share our faith. That's a reference to Galatians 6, and to pilgrims. And what does that look like? How do we honor them? Well, the superior and the brothers immediately go out to greet them with the courtesy of love. They pray together, but before they even do that, they begin with the kiss of peace. They show humility even in their gestures when they address the guest or departing. And this part I think is really interesting, either by a bow of the head or by a complete prostration to the ground. Christ is to be adored because he's indeed welcomed in them. So there's this sense of literally worshiping Christ in your neighbor and greeting your neighbor as someone who's bringing Christ to you. And then inviting them to pray. And then sitting with them, sharing with them religious instruction, showing them every kindness. If it's not a particular fast day, you know, like Ash Wednesday or something, then the superior can even break his fast so that he can be more hospitable. You don't want to show up on a day when the brothers are fasting and then have like a really sparse soup by yourself, or be the only guy eating at the table. So to make the guest feel more comfortable, the superior can also break the fast for the sake of the guest. And then the abbot washes the feet and washes the hands, and they recite the verse, "God, we've received your mercy in the midst of your temple." And then it reiterates this point, the great concern is to be shown in receiving poor people and pilgrims in particular, because in them, more particularly, Christ is received. Like, we don't have to worry about treating the rich well. We already do that because we just are in awe of their wealth and status. We do have to be very mindful of treating the poor well, the people that we wouldn't be likely to do this for. So that is, I think, a radical example of what it looks like to live hospitality. There may be some way we can incorporate those principles into our lives. But before we get there, let's just acknowledge kind of the decline of the virtue. This is the famous painting Nighthawks. It's from, I think, 1943 by Hopper. And you see these people, and they're just, even though they're together, they're radically alone. No one's interacting with anyone else. And so even back in the 40s, there was this sense that, hey, we are coming apart as Americans. We're not living this well. Like, it's easy to say, well, how do we live hospitality now because of COVID? How do we live hospitality now because of the shutdown? But there's a real sense in which, well before a month ago, we had lost what it was to be hospitable. And so it's sad. So again, I want to go back to Leon Cass. He says, look, as Americans, we're really easygoing, right? When we travel abroad, we tend to be very trusting of strangers in a certain way. But at home, we have a relative disadvantage in understanding what is involved in hospitality. He says it hasn't quite died among us, but it's definitely in decline because our way of life doesn't support it. So how many of us make sure to keep extra food in the house just in case somebody drops in? How many of us would be embarrassed at our failure to offer food and not only drink to a visitor in our homes, invited or not? And who in his right mind in urban America lets unknown strangers into his house, let alone offers them food before being assured about their name, character, and purpose? So for some pretty understandable reasons, we've kind of culturally moved away from living out this virtue of hospitality. So I think that's just something to be mindful of, something to be aware of as we look at what it means to live that. What I think we need to recover is twofold. I think first we need to recover the logic of hospitality, and then I think we need to look at maybe some practical ways of living it out. So what do I mean by the logic of hospitality? I want to look a little bit at the meaning of the word. And now again, Cass is a Jewish philosopher, but I think something is going to be added when we look at this through a Christian set of eyes. So he's looking at this really weird word we have in English, host, and because this word is the root of both like hospitality and hostility. It's a host of armies. It's also a hostess. So, you know, these seemingly opposite words all come from this same root word. And it turns out that's not just true in Old English, it's also true in Old French and in Latin and even in Indo-European before Latin. So that one and the same word meant stranger and enemy. And so it means both host and guest, it means stranger and foreigner. And so in the Latin hospice, which is where we get both hostile, hospitality, hospitable, all of these come from the practice of welcoming and tending generously to needs and desires of stranger guests. But also, of course, where hostility comes from as well. Because when you interact with a stranger, you don't know if they're good or bad, right? Like you don't know if they are friend or enemy yet. That's kind of the nature of it. And so at first, you have to decide, like, how do I encounter the other? How do I encounter the person who is unknown to me? And so he says much of the transformation of host from stranger and would-be enemy to provider of hospitality is the work of these often elaborate customs. But even these customs really are giving expression of something more human, a natural human ability and willingness to recognize our sameness, even in the face of our obvious otherness. In other words, in welcoming the stranger, we see that he's a pilgrim in some way, just as we are, which is perhaps why Abraham, who had himself been a traveler in Exodus, should say in Egypt, he travels through Egypt with his wife. He knows what it is to be traveling through a foreign land. And so he is someone who lives that hospitality, probably in part because he's received it. So in recognizing the logic of hospitality, we have to say, like, yes, today I have a home and you're a stranger, but it could just as easily be the other way around, where I could stand in need of your hospitality, of your generosity. Like I said, doing this through Christian eyes, I think we can see something even more, something really beautiful, which is that Christ is the perfect image of the host. Even when we refer to the Eucharistic host as a host, that comes from this word hostia, which has 5 meanings. It means victim. It means host, like one who invites another into his home. It means guest. It means stranger. And it means enemy. And I think we can see our relationship with Christ through all 5 of those lenses. I'm not going to get in very deeply into that. I want to just kind of toss that out there for your reflection. And the only verse I would point you to is in Romans 5:10. For if, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. So remember, this whole idea of hospitality is you take the person who is a stranger and you turn them into a friend. You turn them into someone who you care for. Like, the way you turn them into a friend isn't just charming them, it's caring for them by showing them what hospitality truly is. Christ does that while we're his enemies, while we are estranged from him, while we're strangers to him. He shows us the utmost hospitality by being the victim of the sacrifice, by dying on the cross to reconcile us to God, and then inviting us into his own home in heaven. So there's this dual aspect. So remember, going back a slide, the logic of hospitality is that I welcome you as a stranger because I know what it is to be a stranger myself. I welcome you as a guest because I know what it is to be a guest myself. And so there's this sense of, like, hospitality is really just living the golden rule, doing for you what I would want you to do for me, and welcoming in you this thing I see in myself, that I also am in need of hospitality. Scripture gives us this idea. So in Revelation 3:20, Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him and he with me. So what does that mean? Well, there's something obviously Eucharistic about that too. This idea that God invites us to the banquet, but he invites us to the banquet in our own home. He knocks at the door, and our response is to show him hospitality. And then he will respond by showing us hospitality by allowing us to eat with him. And that is repaid at the end of time. When we die and we go before him, we'll be knocking at his door rather than him knocking at ours. And so in the parable in Luke 13, he talks about how once the householder has risen and shut the door, you can stand outside and knock at the door saying, Lord, open to us. But he will answer, I do not know where you come from. So in other words, if you treat Christ as an unwelcome stranger, and that includes treating the least of these as unwelcome strangers, he's warning he's going to treat you as one as well. But the flip side is, if you welcome him in and eat with him, he'll welcome you into heaven and eat with you at the divine banquet, at the supper of the Lamb. So that's the idea. All of us are strangers, we are sojourners, we are pilgrims, and we are in need of hospitality. So when we show it, We're just modeling what we want to receive. That's the logic of hospitality. And I think if you think about hospitality in that sense, hopefully we're starting to get away from the idea of just a physical space. Because in Revelation 3:20, he's not saying, I'm literally going to stand outside your apartment. I'm literally going to stand outside your townhome. I'm literally going to stand outside your house. He's obviously talking about the door of your heart. So that's the critical pivot, because a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the Benedictine rule, a lot of what we talked about in terms of the way Abraham and Lot are entertaining these strangers passing through, it's inapplicable on a literal level, particularly right now. We're not living in the Middle East where we've got people traveling across the desert. We're not living where, because one of the reasons, just to throw it out there, one of the reasons hospitality is so important there is that if you're inhospitable to people traveling through the desert, they could literally die because you're not taking care of them in terms of food and water. So it was physically necessary that we be good to strangers. That doesn't look the same way in America, right? But what we still see is that there is this kind of hunger, there is this kind of thirst, there is this loneliness, and that's what we're invited to recognize in ourselves and in each other and respond to it because we also stand in need of it. You see what I mean by the logic of hospitality? Like, we need to move beyond just this physical level of that hospitality is just throwing banquets. Like, no, hospitality is treating the other person in a way that makes them feel comfortable, treating the other person in a way that makes them feel particularly cared for and attended to. It's attending to strangers or guests or anyone, really. So how do we live that at home? What does that look like right now? I think we can sometimes look like the guy in this drawing. You get home, you just want to read the paper, and you just got a little bit of a headache, and everybody around you maybe getting on your nerves. Looks like they could use a little more social distancing, and even in their own family. Dad doesn't look thrilled to be there. And we can kind of have that attitude, an attitude of inhospitality at home. So I want to begin. I'm just going to have 3 simple tips. And I think you can figure out what this is going to look like in your own life. Let me just throw out 3 really easy tips. The first one is hospitality begins at home. Charles Dickens coined the term telescopic philanthropy, and it means being really good to other people while being terrible to the people around you. So he describes this woman who is just obsessed with raising money for charities. She devotes herself at this point to Africa. And so she's doing all this stuff to try to raise money for people halfway across the world she's never met. But the narrator soon discovers that she treats her own family like garbage. And I think we need to be aware of that. Like, how am I to, the guys in men's group, as opposed to how am I to my wife and my kids? And if we're a lot worse to, our family, that's a problem. Aquinas calls this the order of charity. You have a duty to your family before your duty even to the stranger and to the guest. So, for instance, if you don't have enough food to feed both your family and everyone starving in the world, which, unless you're super rich, you don't have enough food to do both, you have a duty first to feed your family. Now, that's not your only duty, but there has to be a hierarchy of duties, because otherwise you're treating your family like they are strangers, which is a radical inhospitality, because then you're turning even the place they live into a place that they're more like a guest at and an unwelcomed guest at. So instead of turning the stranger to a guest, you've taken a member of the house and turned them from a guest into a stranger. That's a really radical form of inhospitality. So hospitality begins at home. When we're talking about this, probably up to this point, you've been visualizing, what would I do if someone dropped in? What does that even look like right now? People aren't even allowed to drop in. But think about the members of your own household through this lens. How can I serve them the way that Abraham entertained angels unaware? And St. Paul, he says, well, if a man doesn't know how to manage his own household, how can he care for God's church? And he talks about a woman who's saved through bearing children if she continues in faith and love and holiness with modesty. In other words, begin at home, and salvation is some way tied to how we're living out family life. I think as men particularly, we can be tempted to avoid the house using business or the outside world as kind of a means of escape. And maybe you're more aware of that right now. I'd say right now we have an opportunity to live out hospitality to our family. So make your house the kind of place your family would want to live. I don't mean that by the number of material possessions or whatever, but by your attentiveness, by your care, by your love for them. Serve them even at an expense to yourself in terms of allow yourself to be inconvenienced by your family so that it can be a hospitable place for them. Like they should really look back at this time and say, it was great being locked down with dad, or it was great being locked down with my husband. Like this should be something where we're almost in a pressure cooker, right? Like you're in a small space with the same people constantly. So the little things that might have annoyed you like a tiny bit 2 months ago probably are annoying you like more and more and more. That's normal. But hopefully the little things in a positive way are also growing. So you can try to build up those things. You can make it, fun, make it enjoyable, etc. St. Francis de Sales gives some really practical tips for what it looks like to do this. And he says, look, all those little annoyances, take them patiently. The trifling discomforts, the unimportant losses which happen daily, lovingly and freely accept them. Give them to Jesus with your whole heart, and you'll win his whole heart. And he gives examples. He says, okay, well, the headache you got, or the toothache, or the heavy cold, the tireless peculiarities of husband or wife, the broken glass, the loss of a ring, or a handkerchief, or a glove, the sneer of a neighbor, the effort of going to bed early in order to rise early for prayer or communion, I might add, or men's group, the little shyness some people feel in openly performing religious duties, all of these things that might be uncomfortable to you, take those as opportunities to encounter Christ there and how you react. It's easy to let those things let you be short-tempered and self-centered and inhospitable to others. But if instead you take them and you offer them to Christ, Francis de Sales says, be sure that all of these sufferings, small as they are, if they're accepted lovingly, are most pleasing to God's goodness. And he's promised a whole ocean of happiness to his children in return for 1 cup of cold water. So if you want to know what does it look like to welcome Christ at this time, this is what it looks like. Like it looks like radically offering to him these small things from our day. Okay, that was the first and biggest piece of advice. The second two are very simple. Unplug. Meaning this, if you're constantly on your laptop, you're constantly on your phone, you're constantly in front of the TV, you're missing an opportunity to interact with the people in your home. You're missing an opportunity to live out hospitality in this radical way. And the message that is being sent, even if it's not what you're trying to send, is that you're not important enough for the situation. And I am saying this as someone who struggles with this probably more than most of you do. That it's so easy to be like, oh, I'm looking up this funny article, I'm looking up this thing that I think will be like enriching to the conversation. But if you're talking to someone and they pull out their phone, the message it sends, almost inescapably, is whatever's on this phone is more interesting than talking to you. And so if you come out of this quarantine without having had good conversations with the people you're cooped up with, you should really look at why that is. Like, it's been more than a month now. So hopefully you're spending some real face-to-face time with the people that you're left with, right? So that's mostly advice for those of you who live with others. But some of you don't. And so there's going to be this other advice. That maybe you're not called in this moment to completely unplug. Maybe you're called to plug in wisely. So one of the things Chad and I have been doing is calling everyone connected with the Daily Rosary, with DNA, with this men's group, So if you haven't gotten a call from us, you should within the next few weeks. And we're calling and we're checking in on everybody. And we're having some amazing conversations that wouldn't have ever happened if we didn't pick up the phone. I don't say that to pat myself on the back. I say that to say, look, it's a slightly uncomfortable act of calling someone on the phone after it's kind of become almost taboo to call people on the phone anymore. But you've got people who are totally alone right now and who could really use someone to talk to. Or maybe they're not alone and just need like someone besides their wife and kids to talk to, or whatever it is, right? And chances are it'll be a really enriching conversation for you as well as for them. But I just say that is one way in which you can help create a hospitable place for the other guys in men's group, for one another, or maybe whoever's on your heart. Maybe it's not even someone who's in the men's group. It's just someone who you think like, I need to reach out to that person. I need to see how they're doing. I need to see if they're going crazy in isolation, if they're feeling lonely, if they're worried about their job, if they're worried about the virus, if they're getting antsy, or if maybe they're loving it. Maybe they're praying a lot. Maybe they're doing a lot of spiritual reading. I have no way of knowing unless I reach out to them, right? But once I reach out to them and I ask them, how is it going? And get into some level of detail, well, then we can have a conversation. Like then I can see how things are with them. We can have some warmth. We can have some human interaction at a point where almost every other kind of human interaction is shut off. We can actually engage almost stranger to stranger, right? Like someone who's not in your house, someone who's not in your tight little group of 10 people or less. Here you can actually reach out past that in a way that no one's going to have a problem with by calling them. It may be sending an email, but I'd really say make the phone call. If you've got their number, I would say call them. And I'd say call them today and just see how things are going. Okay. That's what I've got for today. And so let me unmute everyone if I can figure out how to do that. I know there's a way to do it easily. I don't know what that is. So if you want to just push the unmute button, that'll probably be the easiest. I'm still learning this myself. Any thoughts, any questions before we break into small groups? So they didn't know what's going to happen.
Hey, Joe, how does the Abraham hospitality compare to Martha and Mary in that hospitality situation?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. That's such a good question. I should have mentioned that actually, and I'm really glad you said it, because Martha is doing all of the ritual acts of hospitality. She's busy making sure the house is in order and all of those things. But the whole reason you get the house in order, the whole reason you do all those things is so the other person can be cared for. So the other person can be loved, so the other person can feel like they're taken care of. And so Mary she's doing the better part because obviously, given the choice between having like an immaculately clean house or having the person you're visiting actually caring for you and talking to you and sitting at your feet and listening, it's so clear that I don't think any one of us would say, I'd rather have the clean house. But if I was speaking to a women's group, I'd make more of a point on this, because I think this is a vice that women maybe struggle with more than men do, is that there can be this obsession with making sure the house looks good, the house is clean. Like after all, like if you walk into a filthy house, the guy probably isn't going to get the lion's share of the shame or the guilt or the blame for that. And so I think women have a greater sense of like, I need to make sure the house looks good. But ultimately, the reason the house should look good isn't to just like show off your wealth or to show off how good of a housekeeper you are, or anything like that. It's how do I make this an inviting, hospitable space? And all of that, as important as it is totally secondary to actually spending time with the other person. So Martha hospitality right now is impossible. You're not going to throw a banquet for the other person. But Mary's hospitality, the hospitality of attentive listening, of loving the other person, of making them feel loved and cared for, that kind of hospitality is more relevant now than ever before? Gary, that was a great question. What else? What other questions do we have? Unusually quiet for this group of guys. We're going to miss the mute button when we're back as a group. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, I just clicked unmute all in case people were accidentally muted, but there's no background noise, so maybe I'll undo that.
Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think that men are particularly poor in general about having those types of conversations.
Yeah, I think you're right. Tell me more about that, Jim.
Well, for one thing, you know, one of the things I've said a lot in and around men's ministry is nothing happens in men's ministry until somebody takes their mask off.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is this type of conversation that you're talking about is above what I call cocktail. Men are very comfortable going, well, what do you do for a living? You know, where'd you go to school? Do you play golf? What do you think the Chiefs are going to do? And I don't think that's the type of conversation that you are talking about. I think you're talking about a conversation that is sincerely interested in the other person, what their needs are, what their wants are, what their desires are, what their dreams are. That type of conversation in the context of a faith, a shared faith between the two people in the conversation.
Yeah, you know, I think you're absolutely right. My mom tells a funny story about my dad. I don't think he's on the call. Hopefully he won't mind me sharing this. But one of my uncles called and said that his wife had just given birth, and they talked on the phone for about 10 minutes. And at the end of it, my mom says to him, was it a boy or a girl? He goes, I don't know. And so he'd managed to have a conversation with a guy who had just had his firstborn daughter and didn't come away knowing if it was a daughter or a son. And I said that not to throw my dad under the bus, but to throw all of us under the bus. Like, we are, as men, not good at conversation. And we want to do the small talk stuff of like, what are the Chiefs? We want the stuff that's like no risk, not going to get uncomfortable. Unless someone's like, oh, I love Tom Brady, we're probably going to have an easy conversation if we keep it to the Chiefs. And it's something that we are interested in already. And I think that's the other issue is we may not be interested in the other guy, or we may not know how to show that interest. So I would say, as an invitation to you, if you were living in the Middle East in the ancient world, the act of opening up your tent or your house to a total stranger passing through the desert was scary. It was vulnerable, right? Like, you could literally get killed by inviting a total stranger into your home. Leave your door unlocked. See what I'm talking about, you know? Like, you're taking a huge risk bringing a stranger in. We have a similar experience of this radical vulnerability to be told, like, okay, you have to put yourself in a situation where your throat's not going to get slit, but you might be uncomfortable. You might have to have like a conversation that you didn't feel like you were totally ready to have. And a lot of times we just, honestly, we chicken out, right? Like, we just say, I'll keep it light and superficial. I don't want to go that deep. But I think it's cowardice. I think it's inhospitality. And I think that it's a way that we're not living out what it is to love the other person, because we're kind of looking at our own selfish, what do I want to have in this situation?
Mm-hmm. Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've been doing a project here at Nativity. It started, it's called Lamplighters, trying to get us to call everybody within the parish. And I've been involved in a small part here in Leawood South. And it's been kind of interesting to pick up a phone and call somebody you don't know and ask them how they're doing. But I'll tell you, it is certainly well received. And it's kind of an interesting challenge. And I think Jim brought up a good point about guys. You know, we don't pick up the phone and call them and ask them, you know, who won the game. We just ask them how they're doing and if there's anything we can help them with. And it's been interesting, some of the conversations that you end up having, really total strangers. So it's been
That's
kind
awesome.
of interesting for me.
That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Like that's exactly the kind of thing where we have an opportunity, and so yeah, I'd say if you can be involved in that, that's a great thing to be involved in, because this kind of hospitality is in some ways is easier. Like it sounds scary. Like when I started doing these calls with School of Faith,
Mhm.
it was frightening. I didn't want to do it. I put it off, and
Oh,
I dragged my feet on it. Like I am preaching to myself here, right? Like as someone who always thinks like, oh my gosh, it's going to be awful or it's going to be whatever. And it just isn't. It's never as bad as it is in my imagination. And I've had some amazing conversations. And it really is, there's a sense in which it really is kind of catechetical to yourself. Here's what I mean by that. Like a lot of people we're calling are people who pray the daily rosary with School of Faith. And what I've found, and what I think all of the team has found, is that the people who are praying the daily rosary are so much calmer right now than the people who are just spending their time watching the news. And you can see a marked difference. And you can just listen to how the person describes how the quarantine's going, and you can say almost to a certainty whether or not that person is praying the rosary every day. That's something I needed to see. It's something I needed to experience. So even when we're calling, it isn't just like, I'm going to go lead that person closer to Christ. It's also, I'm going to let that person bring Christ to me in some way that I probably don't know about yet. So I'd say be attentive to it. Like you have the chance to serve Christ in another. You also have the chance to encounter Christ in another.
They must have really liked their virtual coffee this morning.
Chad, is there anything I should add?
Hello, gentlemen. No, I don't think so. I mean, one of the things I was thinking of, there's a book I read within this past year, and it basically, I got my kids all around, so it's going to be a little loud here for a second.
It's all right.
So this is John Henry, everybody. Hopefully a saint like John Henry Newman. So, you mentioned the being hospitable to the family members in the home. And I think that's really important. I also think that we have a tendency to kind of bypass our neighbors, our immediate neighbors in our community. And we're just kind of neighbors to those people in our parish or to the communities that we work in or that we live in. And kind of like the Charles Dickens example that you gave, not just people in our family, but also like, we have lots of people in our neighborhood that maybe we don't even know because we've never actually spent time in our neighborhood. And this book was talking about actually commuting to our own home. We spend time everywhere else except at our home. And then when we go home, it's like we push the button to the garage, we pull in, we close the garage, and we never ever see anybody else out in the neighborhood. Excuse me. Allergy season. And so I would just say, what does it look like also to be intentional with those actual neighbors who are proximate to our homes? And how do we reach out to them? That's all.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, because even something as simple as just like saying hi from across the way, like look, one of the things to be aware of, as you're out and about, I know you know this, is like some people are way more worried about this than others. If you're going up and hugging your neighbor, they're probably not going to receive that well, and it's probably not charitable to do that right now. But definitely to say hi and a little bit of interaction, like a little bit of human interaction, saying hi from across the street, whatever. Really having those moments of just human interaction are so important right now because we're starved for them. Like so many of us are just hungry for them right now, right? So one of the guys pointed out a good point I want to add to this, that we should be especially sensitive to those people maybe with a higher likelihood of unemployment right now. So some of us are doing great. Some of us, our jobs are unaffected. Some of our jobs are threatened. Some of us have lost jobs. Be mindful of that. Apparently, there's a higher rate of suicide for guys in their 50s that are displaced. So, you know, if you've got someone who maybe they've built their whole life on their job, and suddenly they've lost that job, and that's the way they've cared for their family, that's the way they've viewed their own role in this world, and all of that is stripped away, and then they're dealing with isolation and loneliness and everything else. That's a pretty powerful 1-2 punch, right? That's something where we should be sensitive and mindful to that. Like, how do we speak lovingly and charitably into that space without just platitudes, right? Like, we want to be able to really offer something more, maybe even help them in some small way to see that their true identity isn't wage earner, that their true identity is something much deeper, something much richer as a son of God. All right. Well, let me offer a chance to live this well. So I'm about to turn off the slideshow, or stop recording rather. I have an ability with Zoom. I've never used it before. We're going to give it a shot to randomly assign people into what are called breakout rooms, basically small groups. I'm going to randomly assign you to a small group, and I want you to just take the next 15 minutes to check in with one another and to catch up with one another. How does that sound?
Give it a try.
All right. Perfect. So let me